13 most devastating mass layoffs in U.S. history. Boeing. A lot of American companies were hurt following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, perhaps none more so than aerospace and defense company Boeing. Most of its clients, major U.S. airlines, had plunging profits thanks to the passengers canceling flights en masse following the attacks. This caused them to cut back orders and ultimately forced Boeing to lay off 31,000 people, or roughly a third of their workforce. The 100-year-old company overcame the rough patch and today thrives as one of the largest defense contractors in the world, with nearly $100 billion in sales recorded in 2015 and almost 150,000 employees. At&T. The At&T Corporation made an announcement in early 1996 that they would be eliminating 40,000 jobs. The mass layoff earned the company the dubious distinction of having enacted the biggest single job cut in the history of the telephone business. The cuts were part of a bid to create more shareholder value following the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It wouldn't be the first time, though, that At&T would make headlines for letting go of a bunch of their employees. In 2008, they cut 12,000 jobs due to what they called economic pressure and a changing business mix. Clearly, though, they are doing all right financially. By revenue, they are the largest telecommunications company in the world. Bank of America. Two of the biggest mass layoffs in history took place in the same month, September of 2011. The biggest of these will be mentioned later, but the smaller, yet still huge layoff that took place happened at Bank of America. As part of a plan to save $5 billion, the company announced that they would eliminate 30,000 jobs. Around the same time, Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, showed their support by investing $5 billion in the bank. Today, Bank of America remains one of the top banks in the country. Kmart. Due to increased competition from the likes of Walmart and Target, Kmart was forced to close hundreds of stores and release thousands of workers in the early 2000s. It started on March of 2002, when the company cut 22,000 jobs and closed 283 stores. Then in January of 2003, they would lay off 35,000 more employees and close yet another 326 stores. Eventually, they would file for bankruptcy before ultimately merging with another company on the list, Sears. Though the merger seemed it would help at first, it was announced in January of 2017 that the company would be closing 108 Kmart stores and 42 Sears locations nationwide. Ford Motor Company. While not nearly as far-reaching as GM's mass layoff, Ford was forced to make a huge cut to their workforce at the beginning of 2002. As the company struggled to cut costs and boost profits, they announced in January of that year that they were closing 5 plants in North America and laying off 35,000 employees. It came on the heels of the company phasing out several cars, including the Ford Escort and the Mercury Cougar compact car. It wouldn't be the only mass layoff that the company would make. In January 2006, they let go of over 23,000 workers. Circuit City. Unlike a lot of companies on this list that enacted mass layoffs to continue operations, Circuit City put all of its employees out of work because they decided to cease operations. Once the country's #2 electronics retailer, horrible 2008 holiday sales, and its inability to borrow thanks to the credit crisis forced the company into bankruptcy before they finally announced that they were going to close every one of their 567 stores, instantly leaving its force of 34,000 employees without a job. The company's iconic signage would remain on many of the vacant locations for years after their doors closed. U.S. Army. In the month of September 2011, over 100,000 people lost their jobs in the United States due to layoffs. The main reason for this was a somewhat unexpected source, the U.S. Army. The military branch announced 50,000 job cuts thanks to the fact that wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were winding down, combined with increased pressure to cut government spending. Sears. Just months before IBM let go of 60,000 employees, popular department store Sears made the radical decision to release 50,000 of their own workers. Sinking sales had forced the company to discontinue their big book catalogues, which had been a popular feature in rural American homes for nearly a century. This, and the shutting of over 100 stores, forced the mass layoffs. United States Postal Service. So many industries have been deemed outdated in the past 2 decades, thanks to advancements in technology, and have been forced to enact massive layoffs as a result. The United States Postal Service knows this all too well, as they have had 3 huge mass layoffs in the past 2 decades. In January 2002, as the internet and something called email exploded in popularity, the USPS was forced to let go of 30,000 employees. Nearly 8 years later, in August of 2009, the government industry was forced to terminate another 30,000 people, and they were just again forced to release that same amount just a half year later in March of 2010. These moves highlighted the fact that the US economy was mired in mass unemployment, with employment to population ratios reaching record lows at the turn of the decade. Some workers like these were left with no other option than to take to the streets and protest with signs like, "Bail out the unemployed jobs now." Like libraries, post offices seemed doomed to close their doors and bow down to the more connected world. General Motors. Anyone who was paying attention remembers just how hard GM was hit as a result of the most recent recession. US car sales dropped from 16 million a year in 2005 to 11 million in 2009. It's no surprise then that the struggling company was forced to lay off nearly 50,000 workers in February of 2009, or nearly 20% of its workforce. While it obviously saved them some money, it didn't do enough as they were forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection just 4 months later. The layoffs came just 3.5 years after they let go of 25,000 employees in June of 2005. California teachers. Though it's the smallest mass layoff on this list, the people who lost their jobs were California school teachers and staff members, making the layoffs extremely devastating. In April of 2003, 25,000 teachers across California were handed pink slips saying that they would be laid off. District officials had absolutely no choice at the time, though, thanks to Governor Gray Davis's huge cuts in education funding. While they weren't all fired, every single one of the 635 contract teachers in one district, Alameda, were issued a pink slip. Citigroup. Investment banking company Citigroup was one of those hardest hit by the economic and credit crisis that started in 2008. In order to survive and move forward, they made the decision to cut 50,000 workers in November. Many predicted at the time that Citigroup was doing too little too late and wouldn't survive even the mass layoffs. They proved these theories untrue, as they remain a viable firm to this day that operates the 4th largest bank in the US, only behind Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and JP Morgan Chase. IBM. IBM shocked the world in 1993 when they made the decision to lay off 60,000 people. It marked the first time that the tech company had ever cut its workforce. The radical decision was made by CEO Louis Gerstner Jr., who was a controversial hire himself because he came from outside the company at the time when IBM had traditionally promoted from within. This act changed the perception that when you were employed by the computer giant, you had a job for life. As hard as the layoffs were to stomach, they helped IBM find a new path and survive. Today, they are one of the few information technology companies with a continuous history that dates back to the 1800s.